Hi, I'm Blair with Wisecraft Handmade, and it's Quilting and Answer Thursday. Every week I bring you tips to help us all be better quilters, and today I'm talking about squaring up your quilt. Now this is another one of those steps that are sort of usually skimmed over in commercial quilt patterns. And I also had a question about this last week, and it made me think that this could be a very confusing step for a lot of newer quilters. I want to go through the process of exactly how I do it in hopes of demystifying the process for you. Essentially, it means you are squaring up all of the outside edges of your quilt layers to be right angles, nice and straight, and ready for binding. So this happens before you add binding, but after you have quilted your quilt. When you are adding your backing and binding layers and preparing your quilt top to be quilted, usually it's recommended that the batting and backing layers be as much as 4 inches larger than the overall measurement of your quilt top. This varies, but you want it to be a little larger on all 4 sides, and then you want your quilt top centered on those layers. So for example, this quilt here I have is about 20 inches square. So I would make sure that my batting and backing layers were at least 24 inches square. That way I would know I have enough extra room on all 4 sides to center the quilt top and have some overlap of the batting and backing layers on them. Now, why do we do this? Mainly because when you're quilting your quilt, however you want to do it, whether it's walking foot, free motion, or even tying, a lot of times the quilt top may shift. And if it shifts, it could shift right on off of those 2 layers. And it's almost impossible to fix a quilt top that's shifted off the layers. So we don't even make that a possibility when we allow the batting and backing layers to be cut a little bit larger and center the quilt top on it. So this is the way I square up my quilt. I will say that I normally do it on my large cutting table in my studio. I used to do it on the floor, but I have found that it's easy enough to do on a tabletop like this, where I can spread out one side of the quilt. I don't need to spread out all 4 sides at the same time. And I'm actually closer to it and can get a little closer to the measuring and the cutting. And so I'm overall more accurate if I do it on a tabletop, but you can do it either way. I have a large rotary cutter underneath where I'm cutting. I just move it to wherever I'm cutting. This one's 24 by 36. I'll link to it below. But if you are not going to cut your edges with a rotary cutter because you don't have a mat this big, you can, everywhere I'm talking about, like lining up my sides and measuring, when I get to the rotary cutting part, you'll just mark it with fabric marking pen or something like that. So here's my quilt top. I have not quilted this, but let's just pretend like I have. It's ready to be trimmed. I have 2 rulers that I use for squaring up my quilts. This one is a large 20.5 by 20.5. I bought it years ago to make pillows with, and I actually use it mainly for squaring up these days. I always reach for this one when I am squaring up. I also have this one that I use with this large square one. This one's 24 by 8.5. So I use these 2 together, and I'll show you how I use them. First thing I do is lay out one edge of my quilt top, and I always start in a corner. I usually start on a corner of a long edge of my quilt just because I like to get the long edges over with, but it doesn't matter. I always start at a corner, and I always use my largest ruler, which in this case is my 20 by 20 inch. What I'm looking at here is the units underneath the ruler. I want to find seam lines that can sort of line up to lines anywhere on the quilting ruler, but I'm also looking at the edge. The thing to keep in mind is that you're probably going to cut a little tiny bit of your quilt top's edge off in certain places. Don't panic if you do that. And there's probably also going to be times when you cut away a little bit beyond the quilt top, which is totally fine too. I'll actually show you an example of where I would leave something like that because you can cover it up with binding later on. Looking at this, I am noticing the seam lines, and I'm finding a line on the ruler here. I'm doing the same thing across here. These are never going to be razor straight. These are made by human hands, not machines, and we are inherently flawed, and don't stress if you can't get it exactly straight. What you're looking for is the straightest horizontal and vertical positioning of your ruler that you can possibly get without cutting too much off of the edge. So you can see I've got a little tiny bit of the edge peeking out here. I've got a little bit peeking out here, but I would go ahead and trim that with my rotary cutter. If you're going to cut it with scissors, then you would just mark it and go back and cut it. So then, usually most quilts are going to be a little longer than this one. So then at that point, I would want to get the center of the edge of that same edge. So I'm going to use this longer ruler, and I'm going to again find straight areas within this quilt top that I can use to line up my ruler. I'm also looking at how the top looks because you definitely want to line it up with the edge of the top. And then what I would do would be to cut across. Always err on the side of cutting away less than more if you're unsure, because you can always go back and make a second pass. So then I'm going to turn it to the right, to clockwise, a quarter turn, and which brings me to another corner. So now I'm going to repeat the same thing I did with the first corner. This time though, I'm not going to want to trim away a whole lot of this edge beyond. I'm going to want to make sure it lines up with what I've already trimmed. I'm going to look at the lines in the quilt again. I'm going to look at lines going in both directions. Look and see how much of the edge is exposed and trim away. Then I'm going to want to do the center just like I did before, and then the quarter turn to get me to a new corner. So I'm repeating this process. You'll notice I'm not looking at the opposing sides of the quilt yet. I'm just looking at one side at a time. So I'm going to line this up. And trim. And then I'm going to want to just finish off that last little bit. And on this one I can go ahead and use my large square again. And so now it's squared up. All of the layers, again, pretend that this is quilted, but all of the layers are now flush, nice, ready for binding. The last step in the squaring up process is that I will take a tape measure and I will measure across the quilt in 3 areas: the top, the middle, and the bottom. So I'll go and I'll measure the top. This looks like it's 18 and about 18 and a half. Middle is showing about 18 and a half, and the bottom is showing a little, like an eighth of an inch more. So at that point I would decide, is it worth going back and, you know, making sure that everything's square and flush. On a large quilt, a 1/4 inch from top to bottom is not going to make a huge difference. On a small wall quilt, I would want it to be as straight as possible. So for this one, I may go back and just look at it again, decide what I can shave off. It's not necessarily taking an eighth of an inch off of one side. It might be taking a little bit off here and there, but I would essentially go through the same process that I just went through, line everything up and shave off a little bit more to get it square. And that's it. I square up all my quilts that way. Don't be afraid if you cut into the quilt top just a little bit along the edge. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a little bit of the edge in order to get a nice straight seam. Here's a situation where you may actually not even cut into the quilt top edge at all, or not even meet it. So if you can see this, I've trimmed the edge of this quilt top nice and straight, but there are actually 2 areas, if you can see them, where the quilt top's edge does not even meet the cut line. Now I know that that is going to be okay because I'm going to cover the edge with binding at least by a full 1/4 of an inch. So I know that that's well within a 1/4 of an inch, so it's not going to show. So those are also types of things that you should consider too. I'd love to hear if you have tips for squaring up, things that have worked for you, things that do not work for you. Leave a comment whether you're watching on YouTube or IGTV and let me know. As always, you can find even more tips, patterns, tools, and tutorials at my website, wisecrafthandmade.com. Be sure and subscribe to my channel on YouTube or subscribe to my IGTV feed to know when each new video is posted, and I will see you next week.